The southern night always smells of magnolias, damp earth, and deceit. In the mid-19th century, the plantation estates of Louisiana and Mississippi seemed like paradise on earth. Massive, white, columned houses drowning in greenery resembled palaces. Here, in dining rooms illuminated by hundreds of wax candles, life flowed slowly and luxuriously, accompanied by the clinking of crystal and the rustle of silk dresses. But none of the guests raising toasts to the prosperity of the South knew they were participating in a game of gastronomic Russian roulette. The greatest danger lurked not in the forests full of escaped convicts, nor in the swamps teeming with alligators. Death wore a starched apron and stood by the stove. Her name was Celia. To her masters, she was invisible, living furniture, a silent tool whose task was to make the masters' lives delicious and satisfying. But in the soul of this woman, burned by humiliation, a plan matured that surpassed the actions of any general of that era in its cold-bloodedness. The kitchen, the heart of the house, became her laboratory. Spices meant to give pleasure became a camouflage for a killer. 3 months, 90 days of silence, 17 graves. Celia did not use an axe or a pistol. Her weapon became a white, tasteless powder that could be bought at any pharmacy to control rats. Arsenic. The king of poisons. She sprinkled it with the grace of a chef, a pinch in the morning coffee, a little in the rich soup, a touch in the sweet peach pie. Imagine this surreal horror. A family sits down at the table. Father, mother, children, guests. They smile, discussing cotton prices and politics. And from the darkness of the corridor, a pair of eyes filled with icy hatred watches them. Celia watches the master bring the spoon to his mouth. She knows this sip is the beginning of the end. She knows that in an hour, this domineering man will be writhing in agony, begging for water. She is the angel of death who set this table herself. The snow-white tablecloth has already become their shroud. They just don't see it yet. We begin the chronicle of one of the most terrifying and silent wars in the history of slavery. A war where the battlefield was a plate of food and from which no one emerged a winner. To understand how a monster is born, one must see the cage in which it was raised. The plantation where Celia lived was a small, totalitarian state in the middle of the endless fields of Missouri. King Cotton ruled here, and his power was absolute. To an outside observer, this place looked like a pastoral idyll. Endless white fields, the rhythmic songs of workers, the majestic master's mansion. But behind this facade lay a grinder of human destinies. There was a strict division in the hierarchy of slaves. There were the field hands, blackened by the sun with calloused hands living in barracks and dying from backbreaking labor. And there were the house slaves, the elite of the slave world. They wore clean clothes, ate scraps from the master's table, and slept under a roof. It would seem that Celia, being a cook, had drawn a lucky ticket. But it was a trap. Being a house slave meant being in a zone of constant, intimate terror. A field slave saw the master rarely from afar through the prism of an overseer with a whip. A house slave lived with the tyrant under the same roof 24 hours a day. She heard his breathing, endured his whims, became a target for his sudden rage or, worse, his lust. Celia was the property of Robert Newsom. This name often appears in historical documents, becoming synonymous with the abusive master. She arrived at the plantation at 19, young, healthy, beautiful. For Newsom, she was a two-in-one purchase, labor in the kitchen and a concubine in the bedroom. For 5 years, she lived in hell, 5 years of sexual violence, which was considered the norm under the laws of that time. The law stated a slave woman cannot be raped as she is a thing, and a thing has no will. The kitchen became her only refuge and her prison. Here, amidst scorching stoves, cast iron cauldrons, and the smell of roasting meat, she spent her days. It was a kingdom of fire and steam. Here she was in charge. Here she could hide, at least for a while, from the master's sticky gaze. Celia's tragedy lay in total hopelessness. There was nowhere to run. For hundreds of miles around stretched a hostile world where a bounty was placed on her head. Patrols with dogs caught runaways and returned them for public flogging. Appeal to the law? The law was written by white men for white men. Her cry for help would have been perceived as the barking of a dog. She was cornered. Her body was taken, her dignity was taken, her future was taken. The only thing she had left was access to what the master loved most in the world, to food. It was in this stifling kitchen, to the sound of sizzling oil, that despair began to crystallize into cold, hard hatred. Celia realized if she could not kill the system, she would start killing the people who embodied it. In the 19th century, killing a man usually required strength. A sword, a musket, a club. These were the weapons of men, the weapons of war. But there existed another death, silent, feminine, sold in apothecary shops for cents. Its name was arsenic. On southern plantations, arsenic was as ubiquitous as the cotton itself. It was a harsh necessity. Grain barns and food supplies were constantly attacked by hordes of rats. To protect the harvest, masters bought poison by the kilogram. It was a mundane household item, sitting on pantry shelves next to sacks of flour and jars of molasses. For Celia, accessing this rodent cure was no difficulty. No one monitored how much powder the cook took to poison pests in the cellar. Arsenic trioxide is the chemical perfection of murder. It was the perfect ghost in the world of poisons, a white, fine, crystalline powder, outwardly almost indistinguishable from sugar or salt. It had no smell. It had almost no taste, only a slight metallic tang, easily masked by garlic, pepper, or strong coffee. But Celia's main ally was not the chemical properties of the poison, but the medical ignorance of the time. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible abdominal pain, dehydration, were frighteningly similar to the symptoms of diseases mowing down thousands: cholera, dysentery, or gastric fever. A doctor summoned to a sickbed saw not a crime victim but a patient with acute gastroenteritis. He prescribed rest, warmth, and, even more fluids, into which a new dose of poison could be added. In France, arsenic was cynically called poudre de succession, inheritance powder. In Celia's hands, it became freedom powder. It was a weapon that leveled the odds. With it, a weak, beaten woman became stronger than the most powerful overseer. She didn't need muscles, she only needed patience and access to the cauldron. There is something monstrously intimate about poisoning. To kill with a knife, one must approach the victim, see their fear, overcome resistance. Poisoning requires trust. Robert Newsom trusted Celia with his food. Every morning he took a cup of hot coffee from her hands, inhaled the aroma, took the first sip, and perhaps even nodded to her in gratitude. He drank his death voluntarily, with pleasure. And Celia, standing in the shadow of the doorway, watched this ritual. At that moment, she ceased to be a slave. She became a judge executing a sentence of which the accused was unaware. Arsenic became her little secret, her secret power. The white powder in her apron pocket warmed her soul better than the fire in the hearth. Every fire has a first spark. For Celia, that spark was a stifling July evening when the air on the plantation was as thick as syrup. The trigger was not another night of abuse, which she, to her horror, had begun to get used to as a necessary evil. The trigger was senseless cruelty towards another. The overseer, a burly man with a perpetually red face, beat an old stable hand half to death simply for unharnessing a horse too slowly. The sound of the whip slicing flesh and the old man's groans drifted into the kitchen through the open windows. At that moment, something inside Celia snapped or, conversely, fused into a single, solid core. Fear vanished, only cold clarity remained. For dinner, the overseer demanded his favorite stew. Celia stood by the cauldron. In her apron pocket lay a paper packet of rat sugar. Her hands did not tremble. She acted like an automaton, like an instrument of retribution. She scooped a full spoon of white powder, a dose capable of killing a horse, and poured it into the thick meat gravy. The powder dissolved instantly. Death became invisible. She carried the plate to the servants' dining quarters herself. She watched as the overseer ate greedily, wiping his greasy lips with bread. He even praised her cooking. The agony began 40 minutes later. At first, it looked like ordinary indigestion. The man complained of burning in his stomach, but soon the burning turned into a fire. He began to vomit. His body tried to expel the poison, but the arsenic had already absorbed into his blood, destroying cells and causing organ failure. By midnight, the overseer could no longer scream. He only wheezed, twisted in convulsions on the floor of his room. The doctor who arrived in the morning, examining the blue-tinged body and hearing about the symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, delivered the verdict, acute cholera. In those years, cholera was a frequent guest in the South, and no one was surprised that it had taken another soul. The most important moment of that night happened not when the overseer breathed his last. It happened when Celia realized she was not suspected. No one looked at her askance. No one checked the kitchen cupboards. In the eyes of white people, she was too primitive a creature to plan and execute a cold-blooded murder. Their racism became her best camouflage. That night, Celia did not sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange, frightening euphoria. She realized that God had left this plantation, and now she was administering justice. She held power in her hands that she hadn't dared to dream of, and the list of those who deserved punishment was long. The first grave was dug. Pandora's box had opened. After the first murder, a criminal usually lives in a hell of paranoia. They wait for a knock on the door, flinching at every glance. But something different happened with Celia. After the coffin with the overseer's body was lowered into the ground, and the priest read the prayer for the dead, silence reigned on the plantation. No one whispered behind her back. No one watched her hands. Life returned to its usual course, as if nothing had happened. And this discovery was a second shock for Celia, stronger than the murder itself. She realized her invisibility. To Robert Newsom and his family, she was a function, not a person. Can a kitchen knife rebel? Can a stove wish evil? In their worldview, slaves were devoid of agency and therefore of the capacity for complex, cold-blooded revenge. The racism that had crushed her to the ground all her life suddenly became her most reliable armor. These 3 months, August, September, October, became a time of frightening transformation. The beaten, raped girl died. In her place, a calculating mistress of life and death was born. The kitchen ceased to be a place of hard labor. Now it was her command center, her throne room. Celia moved among the cauldrons with a new grace. She felt like a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. She began to experiment. She realized that death did not have to be instantaneous. Arsenic allowed her to play with the victim. A small dose caused weakness and nausea. A medium dose, excruciating pain and paralysis. A large one, the end. Celia began to dose the master's suffering like an apothecary. She watched Newsom's family during dinners. She saw the master's daughter grow pale. She heard Newsom himself complain of a bad stomach and weakness in his legs. Internally, she rejoiced. This was her secret, twisted compensation for years of pain. Every moan drifting from the master's bedrooms was music to her ears. Power is the strongest drug, stronger than opium. And Celia got hooked on it, the feeling that these powerful white people, who considered themselves masters of the earth, were actually alive only because she had decided so today, intoxicated her. The most terrifying thing about these 3 months was her flawless acting. Celia became the perfect servant. She fluffed the pillows of the sick with redoubled zeal, brewed them medicinal broths, naturally, with a special seasoning, and looked into their eyes with an expression of canine devotion. "Poor Massa, are you feeling so bad? Drink this tea, it will help." And they drank. They thanked her for her care. This cynicism was a psychological defense mechanism. To survive and continue her mission, she had to kill empathy within herself. She looked at the people she was poisoning not as living beings, but as pests that needed to be cleared from the kitchen. Just as they looked at her, the kitchen became a scaffold, and Celia, standing at the chopping block with a knife in her hand, felt not like a victim, but like an executioner delivering the highest judgment. But the feeling of impunity dulls vigilance. She began to think it would always be this way. Appetite comes with eating, and the thrill comes with killing. What began as an act of personal vengeance against a tyrant very quickly turned into a mass purge. Celia set in motion a mechanism that could not be stopped. 17 people. This figure seems incredible for one house in such a short time. How was it possible? The answer lies in the traditions of the South. Funerals in the 19th century were major social events. When one of the white masters died, neighbors, relatives, and business partners from all over the county converged on the plantation. They came to offer condolences and to eat. The funeral dinner was a mandatory ritual. This became the perfect testing ground for Celia. The death of the first overseer attracted guests. Celia fed them her signature stew. A week later, the master's aunt, who had come for the funeral, died. Mourning again, guests again, poisoned coffee again. It was a gruesome chain reaction. One death spawned another. The estate turned into a corpse production assembly line. Celia stopped choosing victims based on personal grievance. Now, the enemy was any white person who crossed the threshold of that house. Her list included the new overseer sent to replace the dead one, a merchant who came to discuss buying grain, Newsom's distant cousins. She scattered poison like a sower scatters seeds. By mid-September, the county was gripped by panic. Rumors traveled faster than hearses. People whispered that the Newsom estate was cursed. They spoke of bad air, of miasmas rising from the swamps, of an ancient Indian curse. No one could understand why strong, healthy men and women were burning out in a couple of days from a mysterious gastric illness. The house was plunged into mourning. Mirrors were draped in black crepe. The smell of medicine and incense hung in the air. But no one thought to look toward the kitchen, where a young slave woman calmly kneaded dough for the next funeral pie. There is a particular irony in how Celia used their greed against them. Guests arriving for funerals often discussed how to divide the deceased's property or gossiped about inheritance while stuffing their mouths with poisoned ham. Celia saw a higher justice in this. She fed them death, which they accepted with gratitude. She was destroying not just people. She was destroying their entire way of life, turning their sacred rituals of farewell into new murders. 17 coffins. This was her architecture of revenge, built on a foundation of arsenic. In detective novels, poison is often portrayed as a means of clean and quick death. The victim takes a sip, clutches their throat, and falls gracefully onto the carpet. But the reality faced by the inhabitants of the Newsom estate was infinitely far from literature. It was filth, stench, and inhuman agony. Arsenic does not kill like a sniper, it kills like a sadist. When Celia added the powder to the food, she triggered a process of total destruction within the victim's body. 30 to 40 minutes after the meal, the first act of this drama began. The stomach tried to expel the poison. The vomiting was uncontrollable. Then followed diarrhea so severe that doctors of the time called it rice water stool, a term usually applied to cholera. The body rapidly lost water, the blood thickened. Muscles were seized by excruciating cramps that made grown men scream and arched their backs on sweat-soaked sheets. But the worst was happening inside. Arsenic literally burned the mucous membranes, causing a sensation as if the person had swallowed glowing coals. And here, 19th century medicine entered the stage. It was not a savior, but an unwitting accomplice to the killer. The doctors arriving at the estate saw a classic picture of gastric fever or cholera. Their treatment protocols seem like torture today. To drive out the bad blood, they used bloodletting, weakening the already dying patient. To cleanse the stomach, they administered calomel, mercury chloride. This was a fatal mistake. Mercury combined with arsenic created a toxic cocktail that destroyed the kidneys in a matter of hours. Doctors trying to save were driving nails into coffin lids with their own hands. The Newsom family died fully conscious. Arsenic does not cloud the mind until the very end. They understood that something monstrous was happening to them, but they could not grasp the cause. The height of cynicism in this story was the role of Celia herself. As a house slave, she was required to care for the sick. She didn't just poison them, she was with them until their last breath. She held the basin when they vomited. She wiped the cold sweat from their brows. She adjusted their pillows and whispered words of comfort. Imagine this theater of the absurd. The victim, writhing in pain, looks into the eyes of their killer with gratitude and pleading, seeing in her the only person bringing relief. And Celia, handing a glass of water, perhaps with a new dose of poison, watched with clinical interest as life faded in those eyes. It was power, absolute and terrifying, to be the angel of mercy and the angel of death in one person. There is a grim saying, "War is war, but lunch is on schedule." At the Newsom estate, this phrase took on a literal, sinister meaning. It would seem that after a string of deaths, life should have come to a standstill. But the paradox of plantation life was that the machinery of the estate could not stop for a single minute. Cotton had to be picked. Guests had to be received. Relatives who arrived to divide the inheritance or mourn the deceased had to be fed. Celia's kitchen worked in 3 shifts. The ovens did not cool down day or night. It was a surreal conveyor belt. In one part of the house, carpenters were hammering together new coffins, while in another, Celia was taking golden biscuits out of the oven and frying chickens. The smell of incense and death in the corridors mingled with the aroma of vanilla and cinnamon. For the surviving inhabitants of the house, food became the only comfort. In moments of fear and grief, people tend to eat away their stress. They gathered at the long oak table, now half empty, and ate with the greed of the doomed. They sought a sense of normalcy and stability in familiar tastes, and Celia gave them this stability. In those days, she became indispensable. She was the pivot holding the disintegrating house together. She knew who liked what. She remembered that Cousin Martha was allergic to nuts and didn't put them in but generously sprinkled arsenic, and that Uncle Sam preferred his coffee without sugar. This attention to detail put her above suspicion. Could a killer care so much about the gastronomic whims of her victims? Celia lived a double life requiring superhuman self-control. By day, she was a submissive shadow, mourning along with the masters. She lowered her eyes, wore a mourning band on her sleeve, and shook her head sorrowfully while discussing the terrible disease. But when left alone, she turned into a cold strategist, calculating her poison reserves. The most striking thing about this chapter of the story is the blindness of those around her. Humans instinctively look for danger in dark corners, in the forest, in the face of an enemy. But no one looks with suspicion at a plate of hot soup served by caring hands. The kitchen is a sacred place of safety, a symbol of the hearth. Celia violated this ancient taboo. She turned the hearth into a crematorium. The survivors clung to her like children to a mother, seeking warmth, not realizing they were warming themselves by a fire that would consume them. They thanked her for every bite that brought them closer to the grave. Luck is a finite resource, especially when it comes to serial murder. For 3 months, Celia played with fire and did not get burned. But in late October, when the number of fresh graves in the family cemetery reached a critical point, the fog of grief began to lift, giving way to cold logic. Celia's crime was undone by statistics. Diseases were indeed raging in the county, but no epidemic acts so selectively. People began to notice a strange pattern. Only those who dined at the Newsom house were dying. Neighbors living across the road were healthy. Slaves in the barracks, eating corn chowder from a common pot, had no stomach complaints. Death mowed down only those who ate from porcelain plates and drank from silver cups. The catalyst for insight was the visit of Dr. William Crawford, a composite figure of a skeptical doctor. He was not a local healer accustomed to blaming everything on miasmas, but a man of science who read European medical journals. Arriving to examine the latest victim, the master's nephew, Dr. Crawford noticed a detail others had missed. The patient did not have the characteristic smell of cholera. But there was something else: inflamed eyes, a skin rash, and complaints of a metallic taste in the mouth. The doctor did something no one had done before him. He refused the offered dinner. He began asking uncomfortable questions. Who prepared this broth? Where does the water for the coffee come from? Why does the cook look healthier than all her masters? Celia, accustomed to her invisibility, made a fatal mistake. She became too overconfident. In an attempt to eliminate the suspicious doctor, she offered him a cup of tea with a special herbal blend. The doctor, noticing a white sediment at the bottom of the cup, did not drink. He carefully poured the liquid into a vial. It was the end of the curse myth. The ghost had taken on flesh. An atmosphere of paranoia reigned in the house. The The surviving family members suddenly realized the terrible truth. The enemy is not outside, it is inside. Every spoonful of soup now induced horror. People who just yesterday were mourning their relatives now looked at each other with suspicion, but all gazes inevitably converged on one point, the heavy oak door leading to the kitchen. The moment of truth arrived at dinner. Celia brought a roast into the dining room. A deathly silence hung in the room. No one reached for a fork. A dozen eyes stared at the slave. For the first time in 3 months, they saw in her not furniture, but a human being. And in her eyes, usually submissively lowered, they noticed a strange glint, a mixture of fear and triumph. Celia realized she had been exposed, but she didn't flinch. She set the dish on the table with a crash that sounded like a gunshot. The mask of submission cracked, revealing the face of a killer. In the mid-19th century, justice was often blind. Murderers were hanged based on rumors, confessions extracted under torture, or circumstantial evidence. But in Celia's case, a new, impartial witness entered the courtroom, one who could not be bribed or intimidated. The name of this witness was science. Dr. Crawford knew that suspicion alone was not enough. To accuse a slave of murdering white masters, and more importantly, to deprive a plantation owner of his expensive property, irrefutable proof was needed. And he turned to a method developed by the British chemist James Marsh in 1836. It was the Marsh test, history's first reliable test for the presence of arsenic. In a makeshift laboratory set up in the local judge's office, a chemical drama played out. The doctor took a sample of liquid from the very cup of tea Celia had served him the day before, as well as the stomach contents of the latest victim. He mixed the samples with zinc and sulfuric acid. The mixture hissed, releasing gas. Then the doctor directed this gas through a heated glass tube. Everyone present, the sheriff, the judge, the relatives of the deceased, held their breath. If arsenic was present in the sample, it would deposit on the walls of the tube in the form of a shiny, black-silver film. And appear it did. The sinister black mirror of arsenic. Death had left its autograph on the glass, but the most terrifying proof awaited them not in a test tube, but in the cemetery. To confirm the scale of the crimes, a decision was made to exhume the bodies. At night, by torchlight, grave diggers began to open the graves of the last few months. What they saw made even hardened men recoil in horror. Arsenic possesses another macabre property. It preserves tissues. It kills putrefactive bacteria just as effectively as it kills people. The bodies of the victims, having lain in the earth for several weeks, looked frighteningly fresh. They had not decomposed. They seemed merely asleep. The poison had turned them into mummies, preserving their entrails for analysis. The dead spoke. Their stomachs, livers, and kidneys were saturated with the deadly metal. The Marsh test became a verdict not only for Celia, but for the era of unpunished poisonings. In that thin glass tube where the black residue settled, the entire monstrous essence of what was happening was reflected. It was the chemistry of retribution. The invisible powder, which Celia considered her vanishing ally, suddenly became visible. Science had caught the ghost by the tail. When the sheriff looked at the black sediment, he realized this woman in the kitchen was not just a cook. She was a serial killer armed with the periodic table. The morning of the arrest began not with shouts, but with the barking of dogs. The county sheriff, armed with a warrant and accompanied by a dozen armed men, rode through the estate gates. It was no longer private property, but a besieged fortress. Celia was exactly where she had spent her entire life, in the kitchen. She was making breakfast. The smell of frying bacon mingled with the morning chill. When the door burst open and men with guns stormed in, she didn't even turn around. She simply took the skillet off the fire, as if she had been expecting them. The search was total. Soldiers overturned sacks of flour, smashed jars of pickles, ripped open burlap. They were looking for death hidden in jars, and they found it, not in a stash under the floorboards, nor in the hollow of a tree in the garden. Celia had hidden the remaining arsenic with frightening audacity in an allspice jar sitting on the most visible shelf. Hide in plain sight. This principle would have worked were it not for Dr. Crawford's scientific evidence. The sheriff, pouring the contents onto the table, saw the very same white crystalline powder among the brown peppercorns. Celia wasn't just arrested, she was dragged into the yard like a captured beast. The interrogation took place not in an investigator's office but in a barn. In the 19th century, slaves had no right to a lawyer or silence. The investigation had only one tool, pain. She was tied to a post. The whistle of the whip became the language in which the law communicated with the accused. The authorities feared not just a poisoner, they feared a conspiracy. The main question asked of Celia between blows was, who else? They were convinced that one woman was incapable of such a thing. They looked for traces of an uprising, a secret slave organization, a network of killers. But Celia destroyed their theory. Spitting blood, she said quietly but firmly. I am alone. No one helped. No one knew. The investigators were shocked not by the confession itself, but by its motive. Celia asked for no mercy. She did not cry. Her voice held only boundless exhaustion. In this confession, the investigators saw not a repentant sinner, but a broken mechanism that had begun to destroy its creators. She was shackled and thrown into a wagon. As the procession left the plantation, hundreds of eyes, the eyes of the field slaves, watched her go. There was no condemnation in them. There was fear mixed with awe. The cook was leaving for the scaffold, but she was leaving a legend behind. Celia's trial became the spectacle of the year. The town hosting the proceedings was flooded with reporters, onlookers, and angry plantation owners. The atmosphere resembled a powder keg. The crowd surrounding the courthouse demanded not justice, but blood. They chanted, "Burn the witch!" And the sheriff had to set up a cordon of armed men to prevent the accused from being torn to pieces before she even entered the hall. Newspapers of the time competed in sensational headlines. Celia was called the she-devil in an apron, the black Borgia, the snake in the grass. But behind this hysteria lurked a sticky, primal fear. The Celia case struck the rawest nerve of the slave-owning South. It destroyed the myth of the happy slave and the kind master. Every white man sitting in the courtroom went home that evening, looked at his cook and thought, "And what did she put in my plate?" It was not a trial of a woman. It was a trial of the fear of insurrection. The process was a formality, a legal farce. The judge, the prosecutor, and all 12 jurors were white men, slave owners. Celia had a court-appointed lawyer, but his role was reduced to that of an extra at a funeral. The defense timidly tried to mention the motive, abuse by Robert Newsom. The lawyer tried to prove that the woman had been driven to madness by systematic torture. But the prosecutor shattered this line of defense with one brutal argument. Even if she was avenging her master, why did she kill 16 other people? This is not revenge, this is a war against our race. Celia sat in the dock with a straight back, looking over the heads of the jurors. She did not defend herself. She knew the verdict had been written before she even entered the room. The jury's verdict was unanimous. Deliberation took less than an hour, exactly as long as it takes gentlemen to smoke a cigar. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. The date was set for the following Friday. The judge, reading the decision, added that the sentence must be carried out publicly as a lesson to all servants contemplating evil. When the word death rang out, the courtroom exploded with applause. People hugged, congratulated each other as if they had won a war. But Celia didn't even blink. In that room, she was the only free person. The court could take her life, but it could not take away the feeling of power she had experienced holding the fates of her tormentors in her hands. She looked at the jubilant crowd with frightening calm. Her eyes seemed to say, "You can hang me, but you will never sleep soundly again. I poisoned not only your food, I poisoned your peace of mind." The day of the execution, December 21st, 1855, turned out cold and grey. The sky over Missouri looked like a dirty sheet, but despite the piercing wind, the field around the scaffold was black with people. It was not just the carrying out of a sentence, it was a carnival of death. Plantation families arrived in wagons bringing picnic baskets and children, as if to a fair. Thousands of eyes thirsted to see the end of the nightmare. They wanted to ensure the witch would truly die. Celia ascended the scaffold in the same simple dress in which she had cooked her deadly dinners. She walked slowly, not out of fear, but due to the weight of her shackles. Her face was a mask of stone. A priest offered her prayer, but she merely shook her head. She had long ago made a deal with forces the church did not recognize. At 2:30 p.m., the trapdoor beneath her feet opened with a dry, wooden thud. The crowd exhaled. The body of the small woman jerked and went still, turning into a pendulum counting down the final seconds of the old world. The rope cut not only her breath, it severed the thread of fear that had held the county in tension for 6 months. But Celia's death brought no peace. Her body was not given to relatives, of which she had none on this earth. She was denied a Christian burial. According to one version, her remains were given to doctors for study. Science wanted to look inside the monster to find a physical reason for her cruelty. According to another, she was buried in an unmarked pit outside the cemetery fence, the ground sprinkled with quicklime to erase even the memory of her existence. However, erasing Celia from history proved harder than removing a sauce stain from a tablecloth. Her execution had the effect of an exploding bomb on Southern legislation. The Celia case, State of Missouri vs. Celia, became a legal precedent, exposing an ugly hole in the law. A slave woman was not considered a woman who could be protected from rape, but was considered a criminal who could be hanged for murder. After her death, the screws were tightened to the limit. Control over domestic servants became paranoid. Kitchens, previously the domain of slaves, were now inspected daily. Apothecaries were forbidden from selling arsenic and other poisons to black people under threat of imprisonment. Celia died, but she left her execution as a parting gift, eternal fear. Legend has it that many planters in the county could not eat normally for years to come. It seemed to them that in every sip of coffee they tasted the metallic tang of arsenic. Celia became a ghost, standing behind the back of every master raising a fork. She proved that even in the most secure cage, a slave can find a weapon. She did not free herself, but she made her masters feel like prisoners in their own homes, where every plate of soup could be the last. We put the lid on this boiling cauldron of history. The Celia case is not just a 19th century crime chronicle, it is a mirror reflecting the entire ugly essence of an era. Who was Celia? A cold-blooded serial killer who sent 17 people to the grave, including women and her master's relatives? Undoubtedly. Law and morality cannot justify the mass extermination of people, no matter the motives behind it. But was she a monster? The monster was the system that created her. Slavery is not just shackles on the feet. It is a poison that contaminates the soul of both master and slave. It turns the master into a sadist, convinced of his impunity, and the victim into a cornered beast, ready to tear out a throat for survival, or to pour poison into soup. Celia used the only power she had, the power to feed. She turned an act of care into an act of war. Her crime is a terrifying scream about what happens when a person is stripped of their humanity. If you treat people like things, do not be surprised when things start killing. Celia's story teaches us that violence always breeds violence, but sometimes it returns in the most unexpected and silent form, not with the roar of cannons, but with the soft clink of a spoon against the rim of a porcelain cup. Today, only weeds grow on the site of that plantation. The house burned down long ago. The graves are overgrown, but the wind over Missouri still remembers the name of the little cook who once decided that the taste of freedom was worth seasoning with death.